Egypt's President Fattah el-Sisi and Brazil's President Lula reaffirmed support for a two-state solution for the Palestinian cause. COP29 President Babayev stresses G20's importance in advancing climate finance. At least 17 civilians are killed and others injured in Israeli airstrikes on Beit Lahya, northern Gaza. It's exactly 4 p.m. car local time and you're watching Q News. We begin today's bulletin with the latest developments in Rio de Janeiro and the G20 summit. The 19th G20 summit has kicked off in Rio de Janeiro, focusing on building a just world and a sustainable planet. The two-day event coincides with the COP29 climate conference in Azerbaijan, where climate finance for developing nations is a key challenge. Amid extreme weather events and Brazil's worst wildfires in over a decade, the G20 remains a vital forum for global financial and economic collaboration. Egypt's President Fattah el-Sisi and Brazilian President Lula da Silva have reaffirmed their support for a two-state solution. The two leaders met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, where they discussed regional issues, including Palestine. President el-Sisi expressed gratitude for Brazil's invitation, emphasizing Egypt's role in the Middle East and Africa. Both leaders commended the summit's organization and Brazil's focus on developing countries, especially the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. The meeting concluded with a joint statement upgrading bilateral relations to a strategic partnership. Egypt and Brazil have signed a strategic partnership to mark 100 years of diplomatic relations. The agreement aims to boost bilateral cooperation in areas such as peace, sustainable development, multilateral reform, and global trade, with a focus on addressing hunger, poverty, and inequality. As BRICS members, both countries are committed to strengthening regional integration and cooperation among global South nations. Partnership includes enhancing diplomatic dialogue, coordinating on mutual interests, and promoting multilateralism. An action plan will be developed and updated to guide their evolving relationship. During a COP29 news conference, COP29 President Babayev has emphasized the importance of the G20, stating that its leadership is crucial for advancing climate finance progress.
The G20 will be meeting later today in Brazil. They account for 85% of global GDP and 80% of emissions. Their leadership is essential to making progress on all pillars of the Paris Agreement, from finance to mitigation and adaptation. We cannot succeed without them, and the world is waiting to hear from them. We urge them to use the G20 meeting to send a positive signal of their commitment to addressing the climate crisis. We want them to provide clear mandates to deliver at COP29. This is their chance to show their leadership.
Global leaders gather in Rio de Janeiro for the G20 summit, focusing on inconclusive growth, climate action, and bridging global inequalities under Brazil's presidency. And for more analysis, we now move on to Mark in our newsroom. Mark?
Rana. And for more on the G20 summit today, we are joined from Rio de Janeiro by the political science professor, Dr. Bruno Balquini. Welcome to Q News, Doctor. What are the main issues that are expected to dominate at this year's G20?
Well, thanks for having me. The first and the priority will be the events of climate change or climate emergency, the fight against poverty and hunger, and the U20 consortium of big cities to try to develop sustainable cities. Those are the three principal parts of a viable G20 summit, and Brazil is trying to force this to establish a consensus over those three aspects.
Okay, we'll come back to climate change in just a moment. But how effective has the G20 been in recent times in addressing the big political crises like what's happening in the Middle East?
No, not effective at all, because G20 was thought to be a place, a special place for middle powers like, for example, Egypt and Brazil and Turkey. And with the development of the BRICS, it became a middle term between the G7+1 and the BRICS. So I would say that the Brazilian diplomacy is trying hard to establish possible goals to be achieved by a consensus with G20, and also offering more places, like the place that is being offered to Qatar and Emirates, to be part of the funding of those initiatives. But if we go to capacity of resolution, BRICS do have much more capacity of doing things together than G20.
Okay, that's very interesting. So you think that BRICS is more of a route for these kind of issues to be addressed rather than the G20. Let's come back to climate change then. Of course, we were just reporting that the president of COP29 has called on the G20 to address climate change. Do you think there's anything that the G20 can realistically do over the next couple of days?
The first and the first point of all of it is trying to establish a global fund for the initiatives. We know by sure that with the new administration that is going back to Washington on January 20th the next year, they are all denialists, and they will do wherever they can to deny the climate change and the climate emergency. So we must establish a worldwide fund and accept that the new industrial projects must be green ones. And for given examples, the China development is being the China example is something to be copied. I would say so.
And what do you think holds back the G20? What are the problems? What are the issues and challenges that the G20 has in becoming effective?
The goal of the BRICS is to have a bank, the new development bank. The G20 will still operate inside of the post-Bretton Woods agreements, and this is a mistake. G20 should establish a global fund for the strategic goals of consensus. Otherwise, it will be a summit, and only it, an every year summit or every 2-year summit, to talk things between middle powers and superpowers. Without a fund or a bank or a financial instrument to implement the changes that are being discussed in the summit, it will be much more a place to talk than a place to have decisions.
Okay, and by the end of this two-day G20 summit, when they release the communique of what's been agreed, what do you expect to be in there?
The objective of this G20 being placed in Brazil, as long as the Brazilian diplomacy is trying hard to establish this, will be a global fund against poverty in Hungary. And this must be established with short-range chain of value for agriculture. So, talking in more simple words, agriculture with cheap cost, low cost, being produced by local peasants. Funding for climate change is starting with the U20 emergency for sustainable cities, because all of the biggest metropolitan areas and towns worldwide will be affected by the climate change. And then the climate change itself, or at least a fund to make sustainable the forest and the biomes of the world, especially the jungles and the forests, the tropical forests.
Which I know has been a particular problem in Brazil. Well, thank you very much for joining us. That was Dr. Bruno Belchini, who is a political science professor. Thank you very much for joining us from Rio de Janeiro. And back to you, Rana.
Thank you so much, Mark, and we move on to the global leaders who gathered in Rio de Janeiro for the G20 summit, focusing on inclusive growth, climate action, and bridging global inequalities under Brazil's presidency.
The G20 summit convening in Rio de Janeiro under Brazil's presidency has placed a spotlight on global economic recovery, climate action, and social inclusion. With the theme Inclusive Growth for a Sustainable Future, the summit underscores Brazil's commitment to addressing critical global challenges. Today's discussions center on deepening economic cooperation and bridging global inequalities. Leaders are exploring strategies to expand access to sustainable energy while supporting developing nations in combating climate change. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi emphasized digital innovation as a catalyst for equitable development, while U.S. President Joe Biden reaffirmed commitment to climate resilience and global health. The summit also highlights Brazil's unique contributions through specialized forums like the Business 20, which focuses on trade, digital transformation, and inclusive business practices. The Women 20 champions gender equity, while the Urban 20 agenda prioritizes urban sustainability and climate mitigation efforts. Significant breakthroughs include agreements to boost green investments and enhance global pandemic preparedness, showcasing the G20's collaborative approach to urgent global issues. Brazil has leveraged its presidency to advocate for greater representation of global South countries in international decision-making, reinforcing its role as a voice for emerging economies. As the summit concludes, leaders are expected to adopt the Rio Declaration, a strategic roadmap aimed at fostering multilateral cooperation and inclusive growth, encapsulating the priorities of Brazil's leadership.
And now we move on to the live coverage of the Brazilian president's speech and the G20 summit.
الحرج. ملف التضخم الاقتصادي ولم يتم حسمه في هذه القمة سيؤدي إلى كارثة اقتصادية حقيقية، وهو أيضا من أولويات هذه القمة. لمزيد من التفاصيل عن قمة مجموعة
the G20 summit,
ينضم إلينا أو تنضم إلينا
we are joined from Rio de Janeiro, the correspondent of Al Qahira News, Ms. Dina Salim. Greetings, Ms. Dina. Please tell us more details on this summit.
أهلا وسهلا بك يا هاجر. وطبعا
Now we move to the latest developments in Lebanon.
المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
الوضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
The Israeli occupation military has reported detecting around 30 projectiles crossing from Lebanon into northern Israel. According to the statement, the air defense system intercepted several other rockets near the coastal town of Nahariya. Meanwhile, sirens rang out across the upper and western Jalili, signaling a state of heightened alert in the region. Smoke plumes have been seen rising over buildings across southern Beirut as daylight broke. Lebanese media stated that Israeli warplanes have pounded the city of Tyre and Bor Shimeli town. The occupation army also targeted the town of Khayam and the plain of Marajun amid gunfire bursts heard. Residents of the neighborhoods of Shia and Hadith have been searching through the rubble for what little remains of their belongings after Israeli airstrikes devastated the area. The aftermath of strikes on Beirut's southern suburbs and Hadith left widespread devastation with rubble scattered across the streets and buildings. A Kuwaiti military plane has landed at Beirut's Rafiq Hariri International Airport, carrying 40 tons of humanitarian and relief aid provided by the Kuwait Red Crescent Society. The aid is part of Kuwait's airlift initiative to support Lebanon amid its ongoing crisis. It was received at the airport's airbase by Kuwait's Charge Affairs Abdullah Shaheen, along with a delegation from the Kuwaiti embassy and representatives of the Lebanese Red Cross. Now we move on to the developments in Gaza. Several Palestinians have been killed at dawn when Israeli occupation forces bombed a tent sheltering displaced people in Khan Yunis, southern Gaza. Palestinian media also reported that the occupation forces blew up residential buildings in Al Zaytuna neighborhood south of Gaza City. They also continued their offensive across northern and southern Gaza overnight. At least 17 civilians have been killed and others injured in Israeli airstrikes on Beit Lahia, northern Gaza. Palestinian media reported that Israeli forces bombed a house near Kamel Adwan Hospital, with earlier reports indicating that occupation forces also targeted a group of civilians at another house in Beit Lahia. Seven civilians have been killed and others injured in the occupation forces' bombings of homes in Gaza, Jabalia, and the Palestinian side of Rafah city. Palestinian media reported that a drone bombed a house in Jabalia, killing a Palestinian woman and injuring her family members. While in Palestine's side of Rafah city, the Israeli occupation forces targeted a group of citizens in the Khirabat al-Adats area. Gazan health authorities have confirmed that the Palestinian death toll from the Israeli onslaught since October the 7th have risen to 43,922, with an additional 103,898 individuals injured. According to medical reports, the Israeli occupation forces have committed 4 massacres against families in the Gaza Strip over the last 24 hours, killing at least 76 Palestinians and injuring 158 others. Israeli occupation forces have seized water networks belonging to Palestinian farmers in Khirbet al-Diyar in the northern Jordan Valley. Palestinian media reported that the occupation forces also demolished homes of citizens that remained in the el-Jimal community in the valley after displacing its residents 3 months ago. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza continues to escalate as relentless Israeli airstrikes devastate densely populated areas, leaving over 2.3 million Palestinians struggling with severe shortages of food, water, and medical supplies.
The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached critical levels as Israeli airstrikes persist in targeting densely populated areas, further deteriorating living conditions for over 2.3 million Palestinians. Severe shortages in food, water, and medical supplies have left the population in a desperate state. Reports indicate that United Nations facilities, including schools and shelters, have suffered repeated strikes, resulting in significant civilian casualties and extensive damage to essential humanitarian infrastructure. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, has described the crisis as unprecedented in its scale, warning that many of its facilities are no longer safe amid the ongoing bombardment. This has compounded the already dire challenges faced by displaced civilians seeking refuge. In the West Bank, tensions continue to escalate as Israeli forces intensify military operations. Clashes in multiple locations have led to significant Palestinian casualties. Refugee camps have been targeted by military raids, resulting in home demolitions, detentions, and severe restrictions on access to basic services. Concurrently, Israeli settler violence against Palestinian communities has surged, with reports of attacks in various areas exacerbating the volatile situation. The international community has expressed grave concern over the targeting of U.S. facilities in Gaza and the broader humanitarian crisis. Calls for accountability and the protection of civilians have intensified, yet the violence shows no signs of abating. These developments underscore the urgent need for an immediate ceasefire and increased humanitarian aid to alleviate the suffering of millions in Gaza and the West Bank. The situation demands swift international action to prevent further deterioration and address the region's escalating humanitarian and political challenges.
That brings us to the end of our today's bulletin, and here was what we have been covering. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Brazil's President Lula reaffirmed support for a two-state solution for the Palestinian cause. COP29 President Babayev stresses G20's importance in advancing climate finance. And at least 17 civilians are killed and others injured in Israeli airstrikes on Beit Lahia, northern Gaza. This concludes our news bulletin for the hour. Don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at Qnews EG to stay informed. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.